So, we're diving into some dense history today, huh? American expansionism in the late 19th century. And we've got you, of course, to help unpack it all for us.
Always happy to dig into the archives.
And we're looking at specifically Jorge Majfud's The Wild Frontier,
That's right.
which is interesting because, we tend to think of that era as just like this westward land grab, cowboys and Indians, all that.
Yeah,
But Majfud, he kind of flips the script a bit.
he does. He really digs into how this idea of manifest destiny, this belief that America was destined to expand across the continent, starts to morph into something bigger, something more global by the late 1800s.
And he kind of connects that, doesn't he, to like evolving ideas about race and democracy. It's not just about land anymore. Right?
Exactly. And what's so fascinating is how he pinpoints this shift, this turning point, to a very specific year. 1883.
1883. Okay, why that year? What happened?
That's where we see this kind of, it's almost like a changing of the guard, right? You have this focus on land-based expansion that had dominated American thinking for so long, but it starts to give way to this, well, obsession might be a strong word, but this real fascination with naval power.
Naval power. Interesting. So we're not just talking about like controlling territory anymore. It's about controlling the seas, right?
Oh, yeah.
Trade routes, all that.
Precisely. And at the heart of this shift is a fascinating, almost paradoxical figure, Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan.
A captain. I thought you were going to say some like Wall Street tycoon or something.
You'd think so, right? But no, Mahan was a naval officer and by all accounts, a pretty terrible ship captain.
Okay, so not someone you'd want at the helm in a storm, I'm guessing.
Probably not. But here's the thing. He was a strategic genius. And while he was stationed in Peru, he had this epiphany, this realization that naval dominance was the key to becoming a global superpower.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this Captain Mahan and his big idea. What was his vision for America's future?
Well, for Mahan, it wasn't enough for America to just be powerful on land. He saw the seas as the key to projecting power on an international scale.
So we're talking about like controlling trade routes, having a powerful navy that could go toe-to-toe with anyone.
Exactly. Mahan envisioned a world where the United States, with its mighty navy, could dictate terms to other nations, control access to resources, and even influence political decisions across the globe.
And this wasn't just some fringe idea, right? I mean, it caught on, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Mahan laid out his theories in this book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, and it really took the nation by storm. People in government, in the military, even everyday citizens, they read this book and thought, he's right. This is how America becomes a true global power.
It's funny, though, isn't it? You've got this guy, a naval officer landlocked in Peru, and he has this vision that ends up shaping the future of American expansionism.
It makes you wonder, what if Mahan had been say, a prominent farmer instead of a naval officer?
Right. Would his big idea have been about, like, agricultural dominance?
Imagine that, the influence of corn production upon history. But that wasn't the case. Instead of agricultural dominance, we see manifest destiny taking on a new form in the late 1800s.
And that's where things start to take a darker turn, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
As the West fills up that expansionist energy, it has to go somewhere, right?
It does, and tragically, it often finds an outlet in violence and exploitation. Yeah, it's like all that energy, all that ambition, it needed an outlet. And as the physical frontier of the West was closing, tragically marked by events like the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890.
Right. Wounded Knee, of course, a horrifying reminder of what happened as that westward expansion reached its limits.
Exactly. And it's around this time that we see the rise of what Majfud calls, and I'm quoting here, scientific racism.
Scientific racism. So not just like casual prejudice, but an attempt to actually use science, or at least the language of science, to justify these expansionist impulses.
That's exactly it, like trying to give it this air of respectability, this veneer of intellectual legitimacy, and it's pretty disturbing stuff.
And who are some of the key figures pushing this idea? You mentioned Charles Henry Pearson earlier.
Yeah, Pearson's book, National Life and Character, it really sent shockwaves through intellectual circles when it came out in the 1890s.
What was so shocking about it?
Well, he was making this argument that white people were inherently superior, more intelligent, more civilized. And not just that, he argued that non-white populations actually posed a threat to civilization, that they were going to drag humanity backwards if left unchecked.
And this wasn't just like some fringe theory, right? I mean, this was being taken seriously by some pretty powerful people.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, Theodore Roosevelt, who wasn't president yet at the time, but was already a rising star in politics, he was a huge fan of Pearson's book.
Yeah.
He praised it, recommended it to friends, even echoed some of its ideas in his own speeches and writings.
That's pretty unsettling to hear. It speaks to how deeply ingrained these ideas were, even among people who we consider, giants of American history.
Yeah, and it shows how these ideas about race, about white supremacy, were becoming intertwined with this desire for expansion. It's like they provided a justification, a rationale for American exceptionalism on a global scale.
So if you already believe that you're part of a superior race, then it's not a far leap to believing that you have a duty, even a right, to rule over others.
Exactly. Manifest Destiny goes global, right? It's not just about spreading across the continent anymore. It's about asserting American dominance on the world stage.
And Hawaii becomes kind of a testing ground for this new form of American expansionism, doesn't it?
That's right. And what's interesting is that it all starts with economics, with business interests.
For sure. Yeah.
Exactly. By the late 1800s, American businessmen, especially those involved in the booming sugar industry, they had established a really strong foothold in Hawaii. They had plantations, they had political influence, they were really calling the shots.
But they wanted more, didn't they? They saw an opportunity to seize even more power.
They did. And that opportunity came in 1893 when they orchestrated a coup with the backing of U.S. Marines and forced Queen Liliuokalani to abdicate.
Wow. So much for spreading democracy, huh?
Oh, that's where things get really interesting because even as they're overthrowing a monarch and establishing a new government that's favorable to their business interests, they're justifying it all in the name of, you guessed it, democracy.
It's like we're doing this for your own good.
Right. And to understand how they could even begin to square that circle, we have to go back to Frederick Jackson Turner and his famous frontier thesis. Remember him?
Vaguely. Remind me.
So Turner, he was a historian, and in the 1890s, he came up with this idea that the American character, the spirit of independence and self-reliance, it was forged on the Western frontier. Battling the elements, taming the wilderness, all that.
So he's arguing that it's in our DNA, this kind of rugged individualism.
Exactly. And he went further than that. He argued that this frontier experience, this constant expansion and conquest, it was essential to American identity and even to American democracy itself.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So these businessmen in Hawaii, they could convince themselves that by overthrowing the queen and establishing a new government, they were somehow advancing the cause of democracy.
It sounds crazy, right? But that's the argument that Majfud makes. He says that Turner's thesis, which again was intended as an explanation of American history, it gets picked up and twisted into a justification for further expansion.
Because if you believe that expansion is in our DNA, that it's essential to who we are, then it doesn't matter where that expansion happens, right? It could be across the Pacific, it could be anywhere.
Exactly. And Hawaii, with its strategic location and its potential for economic exploitation, it became a prime target.
So these businessmen, these sugar barons, they were driven by profit, obviously. But did they really see themselves as, champions of American democracy? Or is that just a convenient excuse?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's clear that they saw an opportunity to advance their own interests under the banner of American exceptionalism. And Majfud points to the Dole family as a prime example of this. You know Dole, the fruit company.
Yeah, sure. Pineapples, right?
That's them. Well, the Dole family, they were deeply involved in Hawaiian politics after the overthrow. They had a lot of influence, a lot of power.
It's interesting, isn't it, how these economic interests and political ambitions, they get all tangled up together.
Yeah.
And it's not just happening in Hawaii, is it?
You're right, it's not. In fact, Majfud draws some pretty unsettling parallels between what's happening in Hawaii, this kind of corporate-driven expansionism, and what's happening domestically with the rise of Jim Crow.
Jim Crow.
Huh.
So he's connecting America's actions abroad with what's happening to Black Americans back home.
Precisely. He's arguing that you can't separate the two, that they're both part of the same story, the story of America grappling with its identity as a global power and its legacy of racial injustice.
And that's where Jose Marti comes in, right?
Exactly. Marti's story really brings this hypocrisy into sharp focus.
Right. Jose Marti, the Cuban poet and revolutionary, he's a fascinating figure.
Absolutely. And Majfud uses his story, his experiences in the United States, to really expose the hypocrisy might be a strong word, but the contradiction at the heart of American expansionism.
Okay, so set the scene for us. What's Marti doing in the U.S.?
So Martí, he's a fierce advocate for Cuban independence from Spain, right?
Yeah.
And by the 1890s, he's living in exile in the United States, trying to drum up support for the Cuban cause.
Which makes sense. I mean, the U.S. at that time, it's like this symbol of revolution, of throwing off colonial rule.
Right, exactly. So Markey, he travels to Tampa, Florida, which had a large community of Cuban exiles. And he's there to rally support to convince them to join the fight for a free Cuba.
Sounds pretty straightforward so far, so what's the problem?
The problem is Martí arrives in the U.S. and finds a society deeply divided along racial lines.
Jim Crow.
Exactly, Jim Crow. And for Martí, who had, grown up in Cuba where racial lines were more fluid, he's just shocked by what he sees.
So you've got this guy fighting for freedom in Cuba, and he comes to the land of the free and finds segregation, discrimination.
It's this huge reality check for him, and it makes him question, what are America's true intentions in Cuba?
Because if you're denying basic freedoms to a segment of your own population, how can you credibly claim to be spreading freedom elsewhere?
That's exactly the question Martí starts wrestling with. He sees this disconnect, this dissonance between America's self-proclaimed ideals and the reality of its actions.
And it's not just about hypocrisy, right? It's about how these ideas about race, about white supremacy, were shaping America's actions on the world stage.
Absolutely. And that's what makes Majfud's analysis so insightful. He doesn't shy away from these uncomfortable truths.
He connects the dots.
Exactly. He shows how these seemingly disparate threads, this desire for global dominance, the belief in white supremacy, the justifications for expansion, how they're all woven together.
It's a complicated story, but you've made it so much clearer. So as we wrap up, what's the big takeaway here? What do we do with all of this?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that we have to be willing to look at history with open eyes, to acknowledge the complexities, the contradictions, even the uncomfortable truths.
Yeah, because if we only focus on the heroic narratives, the simplified versions of the past, we miss out on a lot of important context.
We do, and we miss the opportunity to learn from those complexities, to understand how they continue to shape our world today.
Because those patterns, those ways of thinking, they don't just disappear, do they?
They don't, which is why Majfud ends The Wild Frontier with this really provocative thought. He argues that in the 20th century, the word race, it kind of falls out of fashion as a justification for American intervention abroad.
Right. It's not exactly politically correct to say we're invading this country because of their race.
Exactly. But Majfud argues that a new word emerges to take its place: communism.
Interesting. So are you suggesting that the fight against communism, as important as it was, might have sometimes been used as a cover for these same old impulses, this desire for dominance, for control?
It's a question worth asking, isn't it? And Majfud doesn't give us easy answers. He just challenges us to think critically, to question the narratives we've been given, and to confront the ways in which the past continues to shape the present.
And that's the mark of a good historian and a good book, isn't it? It doesn't tell you what to think, it just gives you more to think about.
Absolutely. And that's what this whole deep dive has been about, right? Taking a closer look at a pivotal period in American history, grappling with the complexities, and hopefully coming away with a more nuanced understanding of how we got to where we are today.
It's been fascinating, that's for sure. And it's a reminder that history is never truly finished, is it? It's an ongoing conversation, an ongoing process of discovery. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the wild frontier. We'll see you next time for another exploration of history's hidden depths.